Okay, so thank you very much. We're going to begin, and the panelists and our presenter have agreed to be strict with time. My name is Brahm Fleisch, and we're going to be now doing the last session that focuses on education sector spending. So let's begin.
Good afternoon, colleagues. I'm Olwethu, and I will be taking you through session 3 of the seminar, that is education. Right. I think what I'm going to show in this session is what my colleagues Michael and Arabo have spoken about, that there are some sections, there are some spending items within the health budget, and I'm going to show that there are some spending items within the education budget that have been experienced, that are projected to experience real erosions over time. So the South African education system involves 4 elements. So there is schooling education, that is your basic education sector. There is university education, there is technical colleges, that both of them make up higher education. And then there's also a skills system and training for workers. Right. So what we've seen on this budget regarding education is that higher education has been prioritized over and above basic education. And we have seen that with the calculations that we have, that the government of South Africa spends between 100,000 Rand and 120,000 Rand per university student. And it spends around 60,000 Rand per college student, while it spends a mere 20,000 Rand per year on a school learner. And that goes to show that the budget is more focused on higher education than it is on basic education and early childhood development. Another thing that we've seen that's being a trend in this budget, as you can see on the graph above, is that higher education budget has been going up. And also it's not only the budget that's been increasing, but it's also spending per learner, while the budget for basic education is not increasing, it's actually reducing in real terms. Again, this goes to show that within the education sector, fiscal consolidation is more focused on basic education than it is on higher education. So let's move on to the next slide, where I will be taking you guys to a deep dive in basic education. Right, so within the basic education sector, this is essentially how the budget is projected to look like within the coming years. We have spending items that have been fast-tracking, that have been outpacing inflation, and we also have spending items that have been not doing so well compared to inflation. So the items that have been experiencing real gains and have been able to outpace inflation are school property payments. We have transfers to school infrastructure, school nutrition, care and support in schools. And then some of the elements that have not been able to be doing well against inflation, elements that have actually been eroding in real terms, are school goods and services, school curriculum, and the actual basic education budget is actually struggling to keep up with CPI. It's essentially eroding in real terms. And another thing that's eroding in real terms is teacher training through NSFAS, and also compensation of employees is projected to also decrease in real terms within into the medium term. And for the government, in order for the government to realize their projection of compensation of employees, that they do not want the compensation of employees to increase in real terms, then for them to achieve that, they actually have to have significant cuts in headcount, and also significant cuts in salaries and pays. Another thing that's worth noting in this budget is that it's more in line with what the government has been proposing to do. We all know that the government has been proposing a shift from consumption spending to capital spending, and that's actually what we see on this graph up here. But then not all consumption spending is bad, because there's consumption spending on textbooks, which is something that's really, really essential for basic education. And we can see on this graph here that consumption spending on textbooks and consumption spending on compensation is projected to decline, which are not necessarily good things. again, the way the budget that is, Treasury has been warning about a budget that's like this, that it essentially undermines the quality of education, and therefore that affects the poorest of learners, because we know that learners from poor families are the ones that essentially depend on public provided education. And meanwhile, colleagues, with all of these real decreases in consumption, there has been a spending item within the education sector that's been allocated 6 billion annually, and that spending item is the teacher assistant program. Yes, it is an essential good because it does help alleviate the problem of unemployment among the youth, because a lot of the people that are not employed, because even university graduates, it's not just people with grade 12 that become teacher assistant. University graduates that are struggling to find employment, they form part of this teacher assistant program. But if we spend so much money on teacher assistant when the number of teachers is actually falling, it becomes a problem, because we could be spending the 6 billion rands per year on filling posts for teachers to be in schools. So in the next slide, I'll be taking you guys through higher education. Again, like I said when I was talking about basic education, it's that higher education continues to be prioritized above basic education. So from this graph, we can see that the budget for higher education is growing faster than CPI. It's growing at an average of 6.1% a year. And if you quickly go back to the previous slide and look at the total budget for basic education, it is growing at a lower rate than CPI. It's actually eroding in real terms and expected to grow at a rate of 2.9% per year. Within the higher education sector, there are also spending elements. There are also spending elements that are able to grow faster than CPI, as well as spending elements that are contracting in real terms. So the spending elements that are growing faster than CPI, we have NSFAS spend, and then we have the total budget for higher education, SETAs, National Skills Fund, community adult education, and school infrastructure. And some of the elements that are actually eroding in real terms are elements that are really, really important for the functioning within higher education. And those elements are university core subsidies, the compensation of employees in colleges, the college co-grants, and also the one that's looking really, really bad, infrastructure grants. And SETAs and the National Skills Fund have been able to grow faster than CPI, essentially because their budget is not controlled by the government. So their spending envelope is protected by the law. Treasury of the government have no say whatsoever as to how much their spending should be in a year. And from what we see in this graph is that the bulk of the higher education budget goes to NSFAS, which is not necessarily a bad thing, because we do want the students that come into university to have proper funding. But if you have a lot of students coming in, as projections show that there will be increases in undergraduate enrollments over time, but you have spending items like university core subsidies, infrastructure deteriorating, that doesn't necessarily paint a good picture. Yes, it's okay that a lot of people are enrolling in university and that they have funding, but if all of the students are enrolling in university, come in, and then the university doesn't have the right infrastructure to capacitate all of the students, it becomes an issue. Yeah, I think I will move on to the last slide. So the last slide talks about the government employment scheme. So I'll be talking about the teacher assistants as well as public employment programs. So as it stands, before the implementation of the teacher assistant program, the government was employing around 450,000 community healthcare workers and development workers. And these people essentially worked in providing nutrition in schools and early childhood development. And the new teaching assistant program is expected to expand these numbers by 250,000 in new work opportunities. Again, this is a good thing. And the public employment strategy may be able to The public employment strategy may enable the extension of public services at a lower cost than implied by the government's payroll structure. However, many community health workers have been added to the payroll system, and Labour has actually been advocating that other community health workers and the teaching assistant also be added to the payroll and become permanent. This has there's like a good thing about it, and there's also a bad thing about it. The good thing is that as it stands, the money that pays teacher assistants goes to the schools, and then it goes to the principal, and then the principal is the one that actually sends the money to the people. But if it was going through payroll, all of that admin would be eliminated. And what happens now is that this teacher assistant have to wait 3 months to get their payment. So they would go on unpaid for at least 3 months. Something like this would eliminate that. But also adding so many people into the payroll would end up increasing the public sector wage bill, which is what the government is saying they want to reduce. So that's why I'm saying that this has like a good and a negative into it. Again, so my last thing to talk about is that the teacher assistants and the community health workers programs are being allocated significant additional resources, even while the basic education and healthcare budgets are under severe pressures. Like I alluded to when I was talking about basic education, is that there are so many spending items that are experiencing real cuts, but the government keeps spending 6 billion on employing teacher assistants. Like I said, I'm not saying it's not a good thing. It is a very positive thing, but that money could have been going into being spent on some of the consumption items that are really important, such as filling out posts of teachers, also as well as the buying of textbooks in schools. So to conclude this section, essentially what we've shown in this section is that fiscal consolidation within the education sector has been largely focused on basic education, and this will have negative outcomes for poorest of learners because they are ones that rely on publicly provided education. Another thing that we've shown is that higher education, essentially, it supports my first point that higher education is prioritized over basic education. Another thing that we've seen is that the bulk of the increase within the higher education budget is largely due to NSFAS. And another thing that could also be like a caution is that the reductions in infrastructure and increase in projected undergrad enrollment could lead to a deterioration in quality of learning outcomes and teaching in higher education. Thank you.
Thanks very much. That was great. So I think you've given us lots of stuff to work on, and I'm going to turn it over to my colleagues to respond.
Thanks, Brahm, and thanks, Olwethu. I'll be focusing more around the basic education component of the paper. And thanks so much for inviting me here to speak about that. I think it is a great paper. I think Zuki touched on this and maybe Daniel earlier. The acknowledgement in the preface about looking at the budget highlights government's priorities and choices. I think it's something that EE and the BJC, which we're a part of, have been saying for a long time. And it's unfortunate to see budget decreases taking place within the basic education sector because the implications, as you point out, are very real. It's also unfortunate. I mean, it's a very delicate conversation. Higher education funding obviously increasing is a hard-won battle through the Fees Must Fall movement. But it's just tragic that social services are being pitted against each other. You know, a decrease in basic education means an increase in higher education. And I think we saw this a couple of years ago. It may have been 2017 or 2018 when the then former Minister of Finance, I think it was Melusi Gigaba, actually, we saw basic education money moving towards higher education, but we know there's a direct link between basic education and what happens in that sector and how learners learn and their access to higher education. So the implications are real, and those two institutions or those two sectors can't be separated from each other and should be equally funded. So it is quite tragic. I also like the fact that the paper acknowledges that social spending has been on the decrease for the last number of years. We've spoken about that quite a lot as EE and the BJC. I noted that the paper focused quite a lot on teacher compensation, which is good. But there are other elements that I'll speak to very, very quickly that I think as we progress, the paper can possibly cover or expand on in the basic education sector. So in terms of compensation of employees, it's noted in the paper that 24 billion was added to the budget in this financial year over a 3-year period, to be allocated over a 3-year period to go towards teacher salaries. We believe that the amount given each year is only a fraction of what the total cost of employing teachers is. And Treasury itself acknowledges that this will not be enough to avoid a situation where we see fewer teachers and increased class sizes across provinces. So it's a dent, like a drop in the ocean. So our problems are very many. And we also obviously see that you spoke to this in your presentation, decrease in allocations to the sector over the medium term, including towards grants such as school infrastructure SIBG, which is being phased out, and the EIG, which don't keep up with inflation. And the consequences on learners and teachers will be dire. And we've seen this in particular during the COVID-19 pandemic. I think as the paper is adapted, we need to be cognizant of the implications or the challenges that COVID-19 brought about over the last 2 years and how this relates to budget cuts. We need to speak about the high learning losses as well that have happened during this time and the need for additional teachers. I mean, we understand the need for teacher assistance. As you said, it's a kind of a double-edged sword to some degree. Good in terms of, stimulating employment and the like, but we need something, longevity, we can't be losing teachers and on the flip side. I think we could also add some input around school infrastructure budgets or grants and how they are decreasing in real terms over time and what that means for learners. I just want to point out that school infrastructure became the beast that we had to grapple with when COVID first started. It either allowed learners to go back to school, particularly in private and former Model C schools, or did not for quintile 1 to 2, 3 schools. So quintile 1 to 3 schools. So investment towards that component of education is critical to ensure that learners are safe, etc., etc. And this has been like a long-standing debate about the need for adequate and proper infrastructure. And obviously we would speak to the relationship between school infrastructure and learning outcomes, just so that it's clear that this also impacts learners beyond just the environment. I think maybe the last thing that I want to say is we could also speak more around the recommendations that we could be made to National Treasury on how we could, I don't know if it's improved spending, like how we could make this situation, this very dicey situation, a little bit better. And that is obviously more funding towards the sector, but fine. We understand that severe financial constraints. The BJC has also spoken about issues around underspending by provinces that then result in National Treasury taking away more money. Like, we need to address those issues. The capacity of provincial education departments to actually do the work that they need to do, the fact that money is being spent but you don't actually see deliverables that keep in line with amounts spent. I think we need to deal with those. And then we need to talk about irregular expenditure, fruitless and wasteful expenditure, and the money that we lose through those activities, And I think it's just important to put forward those recommendations to Treasury as part of the broader paper on spending. Thank you.
Thanks. That were the very useful insights. I mean, being cautious about setting one subsector against the other, and also looking at the unintended issues, like, for example, infrastructure. In the context of COVID, we have to think about what the implications are with a reduction in spending on infrastructure. Yes. Martin?
Yeah, I mean, thanks to the Public Economy Project for producing this. I'm thrilled that there's more people doing this kind of work. I loved it was either the introduction or the preface to the report that talks about the fact that, you know, these debates have very ideological dimensions to them. The issues are extremely complex, and I mean, certainly, yeah, that's something I think is really important. Researchers outside government can do this, I think, a bit better than researchers in government, where, you know, there needs to be this kind of ideological neutrality. At the same time, I mean, I think that the part of the challenge is for even analysts within government to become kind of more adept at dealing with the ideological side of the arguments, because that is such an important part of the public debates. So I want to deal with 4 specific issues relating to education. So yeah, I mean, as Brahm has already mentioned, I'm mostly in the Department of Basic Education, but I'm also with Stellenbosch University. So I do a lot of work on planning in the department in DBE, and things that I found quite interesting. Questions that I think are raised by the education chapter in your report, I think, are one, the issue of enrollments as a cost driver. You do mention that enrollments are increasing. 2, you talk about difficult salary negotiations. What is difficult? What lies behind that? 3, something you don't mention, but I think is worth bringing up. There's a certain loophole that provinces use, and it has to do with middle management in schools, and it relates to spending pressures. And then 4thly, I'd like to say a little bit about the trade-off between the 2 sectors, schooling and post-school. It's very difficult, yeah, I mean, one needs to deal with this in an informed manner and sensitively. It's not just, you know, 2 sides fighting over a pot of money. So on the enrollments side, we in DBE and I think the country are still reeling from an absolute surprise that came about with COVID-19, and that is our enrollments are now higher than ever before. Now, the expectation when the pandemic hit us was that we were going to see a lot of dropping out, and there were reports of dropping out, and there's a lot of confusion currently around the dropping out situation. Yes, the NIDS-CRAM reports spoke about 500,000 children being out of school, or 500,000 more children being out of school than usual. That was a temporary phenomenon. What the data is very clear about is that we have actually had less dropping out during the pandemic. The disaster lies in the learning losses, and there's a lot of fairly good research on that now, especially at the primary level. So we know learning losses are dreadful, and we need to address those, budgets need to address those. But when it comes to just participation, we actually have this totally unexpected situation where we have more learners than ever. And most of the increases at the secondary level, well, primary is, it was, you know, there was universal coverage anyway. So dropping out has declined at the secondary level. We had 200,000 more grade 12s than we expected in 2021. We have 500,000 more learners in secondary schools than we had 4 years ago. Now, this increase started already in 2018, before the pandemic. And in some ways, the pandemic actually encouraged retention of learners in schools. We don't quite understand how this works. Part of it could simply be huge problems in the labor market during the pandemic. So young people have just stayed on in schools. Some of it relates to promotion rules that we introduced during the pandemic between grades 11 and 12. But bottom line is we have a lot more children and youths to cater for in basic education. And that obviously has budgetary implications. And there's a very special danger here that I think we can easily lose sight of. The way in South Africa, we have a rather strange kind of accounting system for schooling in the sense that we very seldom account separately for primary and secondary schools. Drives the IMF crazy because countries report by those levels. We often don't do that because of the way our system works. It's the same salary structures across the two levels and so on. One of the dangers that we sit with, and it may easily fall off the radar, is that the enrollment increases at the secondary level are going to suck funding out of the primary level, because that's the way the teacher distribution model works. So that is a real danger we face, that primary schools are going to be depleted of teachers to an even greater extent than secondary schools. There are obviously ways of dealing with that, but then it means unions, the post-provisioning model, and so on. So then moving on to the second point, the difficult salary negotiations. Salary negotiations are inherently difficult. I was happy to hear, Olwethu, that the Public Economy Project has some payroll data to work with, because what's absolutely essential in order to get a deeper understanding of salaries is digging into the payroll data. So I'm very glad that you have that access. And I mean, at the DBE, we're trying to, even with the POPIA Act and everything, to try and put together data sets that a wider range of researchers can look at, so that we can get better research into the into payroll trends and so on. And I mean, we do sit with a very serious problem in government, that there's just not enough work across the key departments who should be looking at this: DPSA, Treasury, the line departments, but also the bargaining chambers. The bargaining chambers are quite well funded. They're not doing enough work on on salaries. What are the things that are really difficult to deal with just analytically? I think on the one hand, the trade-off between numbers of employees and average unit cost. So a lot of the salary negotiations focus on unit cost only. There's hardly ever any consideration when teacher unions talk to government around what are the implications in terms of numbers of teachers of having this particular wage agreement. And the other thing that I think is easily, that is difficult, is looking at the unit costs over time in a context where teacher age is changing. So we turned a corner about 3 years ago. Average age of teachers had been on the increase. It's now starting to decline because this large bulge of older teachers is moving out of the system. That has quite large cost implications, because the younger your teachers are, the lower the unit cost relatively, because younger people earn less than older people because of the way the salary structure works. So trying to model that and understand what the implications are of the demographics of the teaching force or the nursing force, 10, 20 years into the future, is a challenge. And then one other thing that I picked up recently, and I hadn't even thought about this before, is it's useful to look at where in the tax brackets the public employees are. So there are a lot of figures around. This is the degree to which the average cost of educators has been increasing, but they've actually been moving into higher tax brackets at the same time. So that overstates the increase a bit. Obviously, if they're paying tax, it's money that goes back into the fiscus, but it also has implications for understanding the purchasing power of teachers. And these are obviously things that should be in the salary negotiations, and are actually not. There's just a need, I think, for a lot more analysis to inform these processes. And I mean, Edgar Sisha was making the point earlier on about provinces underspending in basic education. Part of this relates to the use of data for planning. Very often provinces, they're under pressure from their provincial treasuries not to overspend. They have a few months left in the year, they want to appoint and so on, and because the projections don't work very well, they put the brakes on too early, and then they end up underspending because they just couldn't project very well what hiring and what was going to cost in the coming months. Thirdly, then, this loophole. What I think is quite striking is that provinces have done, I think, a surprisingly good job at protecting non-personnel spending. We went through a period 20 years ago when that was not the case, and non-personnel spending was just squeezed, crowded out completely by personnel spending. I think this time there's a certain discipline in the provinces. Obviously it means freezing posts and so on, but at least it ensures that one doesn't overly limit spending on non-personnel items. But there is one trick that provinces use in order to stay within budget. They just don't promote into management posts in schools. So school principals are hired because there has to be a school principal in every school. But heads of department in schools and deputy principals are kind of fair game. You just cut. Limpopo in the last 10 years has reduced its number of kind of school middle managers by 50% over 10 years. Now that has implications firstly for school management, and Limpopo now has the worst ratio in the country when it comes to teachers to middle managers in schools. The implications are worse management, but also you mess up the whole incentive structure for teachers, because the key incentive for teachers, or a key incentive, is I may go into one of those posts and earn more in future. If you remove that middle management layer, you are creating, worse incentives for your teachers. And then, I'm almost finished. The fourth point, this issue of the trade-off between schooling and post-schooling. Your graph, yes, shows that the average cost for basic education per learner spending is on the decline. It's kind of flat for higher education, suggesting that basic education is feeling the pinch more than higher education. One has to look carefully at that. The thing is that you're seeing expansion in enrollments in post-school. Most of that expansion is poorer students who need more funding. So there is some justification for increasing the average, or being a bit more generous towards higher post-school education than school education. However, what we now need to look at is this expansion of secondary school enrollments, and that is almost certainly also poorer learners. And what does that mean for the whole equity situation? Thank you.
Thanks, Martin. And what you've done is added another layer of complexity to the analysis. So I think it's been very useful, both to the kind of broad distinctions between higher ed and schooling, but also, all the nuances about the gradations of posts and how that impacts on the budget, issues related to enrollment and how that needs to be factored in. So thank you for that. Spencer?
Okay, thanks very much, and thanks for having me. Thanks also for the insightful presentation and the paper in general. Yeah, I think one of the key points for me from that the paper does and that we don't often see is that it starts to look at the choices and to really pull them out. The choices that are made in the budget. I don't want us to lose sight of that because I think that's an important point. Somebody earlier also said that those choices are political, they're necessarily political choices. But it's interesting to draw them out and to see them and to discuss them and to unpack them. The budget documents don't always do that in a way that this paper does, where, you know, that's one of the things I enjoyed about the paper in particular was that it makes it easy to read. It's a lot easier for anybody to kind of see what those choices are. All that information is in the budget documents, but it's just a nice way to bring it out. So I don't want us to lose sight of the fact that we are talking about choices. And listening to not just this panel, but some of the other discussions earlier, you get a sense that if there were no choices to make, we'd fund all those things. But that's not possible. And so there have to be those considerations. It's not possible because we don't have an infinite amount of money. So there have to be those choices. And sometimes what also happens is that there's a COVID-19 crisis, and so additional money has to come into the system from somewhere. And so the choice is about defunding something to give to other places. And those choices are made at national government, but we also mustn't lose sight of the fact that they're made at provincial government. So something maybe to look at a little further, particularly around this education sector and the health sector, where implementation is at provincial level, is looking at what kind of choices the provinces make as governments and then as education departments. So, for example, the paper highlights and the budget documents also talk about this 24 billion that's added to education in provinces for compensation of employees to sort of protect the number of teachers in the sector and class size and so on. But provinces now have that choice whether to use the money in that way or not. And that's something I think is the next step of your analysis. Will now have to go and look at what kind of choices are made at provincial level and what are the impacts and implications of those choices. I think that there's been a lot of discussion about COE, compensation of employees here, and necessarily so for education. If you're looking at the education budget or you're talking about education budgets, that has to be first up. It has the biggest impact when you talk about growth or low growth or whatever, and you're looking at all those other items that you list there, some of them that are growing faster than CPI, property payments, there's growing by very much. It's a fraction of the budget. Although the growth is very high, it's very small. And because COE is growing at under 3%, the overall budget will grow at that, more or less at that amount. And just to remember that the COE that is projected in that budget doesn't include whatever new wage agreement comes into power. So at the moment, the wage projections that are in there is for a very low growth scenario. And that accounts, I think, for some of the COE projections. But having said that, I think the fact that the budget documents do acknowledge that COE is something to be concerned about. Martin has given us another area to be concerned about around this enrollment growth. But even just with the current enrollment trajectory that we were aware of, the idea that we need to protect at least the number of teachers that are there so that we don't see this ballooning in class size is important and something that we want to keep an eye on. I will talk a little bit about another choice. We all spoken about it a little bit. You've also alluded to it. That figure 11 in the paper is what stands out for me as interesting but also scary to see the per learner enrollment in schools, not enrollment, allocation, as opposed to the per student allocation at higher education level. Now, I mean, it is necessarily different. Higher education is much more expensive. There are far fewer people who go that way as well. So it is going to be more expensive. But the change, I think that step change, and your graph that you had up earlier shows it. So it's not just the difference between the two, but it's the change right at the beginning that you see higher ed going. It shows, as you point out, that is a choice that government made at some point. And there's in society, there's a lot of support for that choice. But that is a choice and it has implications. And it had implications either that we had to push up VAT, or we had to or we had to get money from elsewhere in the budget to fund that choice. But that's a choice, and it has implications for other things that we then have to unchoose, if you like, if there's such a word. What is a concern as well, growing concern going forward now, stemming from that choice, is the share of the higher education budget that NSFAS takes. And that you do point this out, but it is a growing concern, I think, where we sit as well, because you're getting to a point where that budget for student bursaries is exceeding the allocation for higher education subsidies, for university subsidies. So you speak about the quality of the programs, the infrastructure for the expanding sector, to accommodate the expanding sector. All of those things are being eroded by, that's another choice. Right, so years, and it's almost a choice now that we can't not allocate money to, because if the students are coming into university, if they're qualified to come in, there's this policy that will compensate them, that will allow them entry and fund them to be able to study at university and TVET colleges. So at the moment, the Minister of Higher Education and Training and Innovation, Science and Innovation, has a ministerial task team to look at some sort of sustainable model to address this issue of student funding. And we await, the report from this ministerial task team. On how a government can then approach student funding going forward to address all of those issues that we spoke of, and there are a number of other ones around there as well. And then I think just a last point is around the Presidential Youth Employment Initiative. So you spoke about that a little bit. I want to just talk about some aspects of that in relation to the education one. And I think you, in the paper, the education assistance is sort of put up as money spent on them instead of on education or on teachers. And that is one way to look at it. But I think that another way to look at it is that youth employment initiative is an employment initiative more than an education initiative. And as an employment initiative, its objective is to get as many youth into meaningful employment. It is meant to be a temporary employment initiative for that cohort. And for there's an allocation over 2 years, so there's another cohort, so that the opportunity is spread as broadly as possible. But it is an employment initiative, and I think that it also has elements, education benefits to it. Which is great. So it's not just an employment initiative for the sake of employing youth. It also has very, I feel, benefits for education in general, and some of the anecdotal evidence coming from practitioners and from teacher unions is all very positive in that respect as well. So I think that that's an element that we will keep an eye on. We would like to do some serious research around both the employment and the educational benefits of the program, because I don't see it as a replacement of a teacher, but certainly as a resource to improve teaching and learning, as well as providing this employment opportunity. I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thanks, Spencer. I think one of the big takeaways from your comment is to kind of pivot to a much closer examination of the teacher expenditure. I mean, given the centrality in the budget, all those fine-grained kinds of analyses will be very important in understanding what's happening within the budget process. Now, I'm mindful we're beyond the time frames, but if there are questions either from the broader public who are listening online or from the House, I'll just take one or two questions and then we'll have a wrap-up.
We have two questions from the online. The first, while the spending for non-personnel expenditure may be better protected, is it appropriate to meet non-personnel needs, and does it reflect an 80-20 division as recommended in the norms and standards? And then the other one, slightly longer. Inflation in the healthcare and parts of the education sector are higher than CPI. National Treasury doesn't seem to take actual inflation levels for these sectors into account in the budget. Olwethu, could the report include these higher sector inflation levels in its analysis to allow us to have a look at the more sobering real expenditure cuts?
Okay.
Okay. They're asking, could the report include these higher sector inflation levels in its analysis to allow us to have a look at the most sobering real expenditure cuts?
Okay, and if there are any other questions from the House? No. So what I'd like to do is, I think both Olwethu and Spencer, those questions are directed to you. So in your kind of closing remarks, if you could, I'll give you the last word, but if you could address, and then everybody can have your last 30 seconds, just kind of bring together your comments and to respond to the other people here. Let's start.
All right, as a closing remarks, I mean, just hearing everybody talk and obviously knowing what is happening within the basic education sector, I think we need to acknowledge just how vast it is, how much contributes to it, from teachers to textbooks to furniture to infrastructure to school meals and all of that. And it is deserving and needs more money allocated towards it. And we mustn't forget that it's also an immediately realizable right. But many learners that we speak to aren't experiencing it in that way at all. There are always stumbling blocks to get into, the fulfillment of this right and their schooling experience. There's a big admissions problem and in fact court case that's going to be taking place in the Western Cape because there are some learners who haven't been able to access schools since the beginning of the year. And one of the points that's highlighted there is that we don't have money to build more schools or to add additional classrooms, etc., etc. So the implications in disinvesting in education are quite huge. My last point is that in the context that we're in, where there are limited financial resources, but a proliferation of spending needs, decisions around education and monitoring expenditure require us to be more, we need to scrutinize them more. And beyond just calling for education budget increases, we need to find a way or at least we need to speak about what recommendations we can make as civil society academics on how we fund this sector rather than, we need to find a way around this, addressing this problem as a whole. Thank you.
Martin?
Thanks. Just that I think I'm very glad that this project is bringing more analysts to the table, and I look forward to future editions of this report. I think your emphasis on kind of trying to put things in simple terms has been quite successful, and that is so important. I think what we do have to acknowledge is that very often very influential people in the education policy debates have quite a superficial understanding of the whole expenditure system, and the reason why is because it's damn difficult to understand it and to follow it. Even analysts struggle to kind of get their heads around this. So communicating this is really important. And what has struck me is this question or the statement that has arisen today on several occasions. This is a budget that is going to worsen inequality. Now, that may well be the case, but there's not a lot of really good analysis of that. So I think that part of the challenge is to take these kinds of expenditure analyses beyond just expenditure analyses and to look at the impact of these budgets on inequality in the country, with inequality being a central theme. These are not easy analyses to do, and they're not simple answers to this, but certainly this is something that I think we need to look at more. Thanks.
Yeah, okay. I know you're also going to respond to the 80-20 question. No, you're going to respond to the 80-20 question, or was that Martin? Anyway. The inflation question, I'll just talk quickly about that, and maybe you can add to that if you like at the end. The education inflation, if you like, is often higher than CPI, and the question is, are those elements taken into consideration in the budget? And the point about education inflation, when it is higher than CPI, most of the time it is driven by the salary increases. So the salary increases over the past, not in the recent past, but over the last 10 years, exceeded CPI. And hence your education inflation, whether it is through the teachers who are paid by school governing bodies in schools that have them, and teachers in the state sector, that then drives education spending, because it makes up such a big component of the spending. It pushes it above CPI, and we see spending growing faster than CPI. But it's the big driver there is the salaries, and that certainly is part of the considerations when the budgets are put together. And then just a last closing comment. So I support particularly what Martin said about the paper and what it's trying to do, and your work and what that's trying to do. I also, somebody spoke about it a little earlier, but I also want to applaud the timing of the engagement. I think there's a lot of engagement around budget time and October around the medium-term budget policy statement time, but this is a good time to have the discussions around what kind of choices there were in the budget as these discussions then inform the new budget. So it's a good time for it to happen. I think something to watch for going forward in our sector is early childhood development. It's now part of basic education, and it's a big sector, and there's a danger that it is going to be subsumed by the bigger basic education, the schooling, and we need to guard against it, but it's a sector that can have major implications on our education performance. So I think it's something we want to look at very closely, and maybe for you also to look at very closely going forward. Thank you.
Thanks, Spencer. Wait.
Okay, I'll have my take of the questions from the online audience first, and then I will go on and give my inputs on what the panelists shared. Someone asked if it's appropriate to protect non-personnel needs over personal spending. I think some of the things that we discussed, and also the panelists has discussed, is that there's a lot of importance in things like infrastructure, especially, I think it was Hopolang who raised that, especially when COVID-19 hit, and a lot of students within the basic education, public education, essentially have lost so many schools when they could have maybe learned from home, or if there was better infrastructure in schools, then they could have practiced social distancing and came back to schools. So I'm not sure if it's a question of whether it's appropriate or not, but I do think that it's essential to protect non-personnel spending. I don't know if anyone else in the panel would like to have a go. But also the question about sort of reporting education sector inflation or health inflation. As a project, I do think that it's something that we could do if we feel like it's something that has more value add than the analysis that we do have. That's something that we could have a go at and look at. So going back to the panelists, really fascinating thoughts that you guys shared, and there were a lot of things that I think that as a team, the public economy team, we could incorporate into our work going forward. Like Michael and Arabo shared, this is not a once-off thing. This is a project that we plan to work over and over. This is our first go with the project. So there are a lot of things that maybe you guys would have liked to see that we didn't cover. But again, we appreciate the feedback. We appreciate the comments. These are things that we will look at going forward. One of the things that I think was like an overarching theme of our discussion was that there's sort of a shift between basic education and higher education. It's like kids fighting for the mother's love. Like no one is getting 50-50. The other child has to get less, and then the other child has to get more. And I think maybe the government needs to move away from that and prioritize basic education as well as it prioritizes higher education. Because again, like Hopolang was saying, higher education sort of deserves the funding that it has. A lot of students fought. I was one of those students that fought during FISMAS 4. So we fought for the funding that's in higher education, but at the same time, it shouldn't be a thing of because the students in higher education fought for funding, then the student in basic education should suffer. There should be like some form of balance in that. And another thing that Hopolang raised was that, which was also in the report, but then unfortunately it was not in my presentation, that the higher learning losses during COVID-19, there was no planning for like how are we going to recover from that, especially in the public education sector. There was no budget allocation, no planning, nothing. When students went back to school, it was business as usual. I don't even know how teachers did it because the government, in my sense, I didn't see them providing guidance as to how they have to care catch up for the number of days that the students have lost in school. Okay, just give me a minute. Going through my notes. And then Martin spoke. There is sort of a question that I may have for you. I don't know if it's a question or if it's just an observation from what you said. It's really fascinating, the thing that you were saying, that spending within basic education is moving away from primary education to secondary education. And you also noted that the number of grade 12 learners went up. And my question to that is, I know that in public education, students are allowed to repeat grade 12. So are we sure that those are first-time entrants in grade 12, or it's also inclusive of people who are repeating grade 12? Because students are allowed to shift schools and move. If I fail my grade 12 in this school, then I can move to the other school. So maybe we need, a bit more clarity on that. I think another thing that I found fascinating that you were talking about was actually looking at which tax bracket do the teachers fall under. I did my work for my honors level on wage bill, but I never saw any work that focuses on the actual tax bracket that these public employees actually fall under. So I think that would be a really interesting analysis, and I don't know if the team and I could maybe look at something like that. It would be really fun. It would be like bringing something new to the debate, so that would be fascinating and interesting. Moving on to Spencer's comments. He also highlighted that this is just looking at the choices made. So there's this much money, and then what are the choices that you are making with that money? And I think another thing that most people look at, or most people ignore, is that national government says to provincial government, this is the money. And in as much as it's like, okay, with this money you do this, but also provincial government has a choice to make as to how are we spending this money. So maybe as a team, it could also be something that's worth looking into, that what are the choices that are being made about the budget at provincial level. That would be something that maybe we could look at going forward. And another thing that I really, really liked when you were talking was when you spoke about the teacher assistant program, that in as much as it's within the education sector, it's not just an education employment program, it's a youth employment program. So I would really, really like if there would be yes, there is an education task force. So I would really, really like to read that presentation on the impact that it has on youth employment and the impact that it has on education employment. I'm anticipating that the impact on youth employment will be positive, and I'm more interested on seeing what is the impact on education, like is there value add for teacher assistant at the education level. That's all from me, and thank you so much for fascinating discussion.
Thank you very much for the panel and a fantastic presentation. Again, I think it's fulfilled the mandate, which has given us insights into spending choices, but also from the panel, a whole new way of thinking about the analysis for the next round. So thank you, everybody.
Hi, everyone. Can we move on? So my kind of job here is to close and to kind of thank you, and I do realize that I stand between you and your lunch, but I can't resist the temptation to say a few things. I think this has been a kind of immensely kind of useful kind of report, and a kind of immensely kind of useful set of comments and discussions that we've had today. And I'd like to just congratulate the kind of team at SCIS, both those who wrote the kind of report, but also the team that made the day happen, for the fantastic work that you've done to make this happen. I think it's kind of precisely for the reasons that many of you have mentioned, the need for us to kind of debate these choices, to kind of interrogate the questions that have the kind of choices that have been made, and to subject that to kind of an analysis, to subject it to kind of questioning. That's the kind of essence of why we've set up the public economics kind of program at SEIS. There are 3 points that I take from the session and from the sessions, and I thought it might be worth in closing just to share some thoughts with you on that. I think we should be very concerned about the point that Michael raised in the first session about the debt kind of issue, and how we kind of essentially kicking that can down the road kind of every year. Whatever your view is on kind of how we should handle that debt, I think we would all probably agree that the kind of approach of putting that difficult conversation off year after year after year is not a sensible way to run fiscal policy. And I think it's kind of really important that we make that point. The kind of second issue is I think this kind of question about how you deal with the fiscal consolidation process and what that is going to mean for the kind of quality of public services is really important. I think quite clearly, if you kind of reducing kind of expenditure on those critical services, the kind of only way to maintain the quality of those services would be to put up some sort of coherent and reasonable argument for why we might have some sort of productivity effect in the provision of those services, making up for the fall in the total expenditure on what are essentially key constitutional requirements of the state. I'm not sure what you think about it, but my sense is that we don't have any kind of reasonably coherent argument that says that the state's restructuring process is going to generate levels of productivity growth that is likely to make up for that fall in expenditure. And kind of if we're in that world, I think we should all be kind of exceptionally concerned about the likely declines in both the expenditure but also in the quality of those services, which are absolutely key to maintaining sustainability in our society and to addressing kind of all of the inequalities in our society. The final point I wanted to raise is a point that Gilad kind of highlighted, and I think this applies to possibly all of the sessions we had today. And Gilad asked the question: what exactly are the political choices that drive why kind of certain choices have been made for why you you would increase expenditure on one thing, and why would you decrease it on another? And the response that came from kind of Edgar in the budget office was, well, this is not National Treasury's choices. These are political choices. And I think properly so, right? We should, budget expenditure should be driven by kind of our publicly elected kind of MPs driving a set of political choices that kind of outline what we think our society's choices kind of choices should be. But it does seem to me that the kind of choices that have been made don't have any kind of reasonable coherence to them. Let me highlight a few of them, right? So we're increasing expenditure on kind of teaching assistance through the president's kind of employment stimulus package, but we're decreasing expenditure on kind of staffing of the education system. Essentially, what that choice is it kind of has to be a decline in the quality of education services, and it doesn't seem to me, if you balance those side by side, that that's a reasonably coherent decision that has been made. Another example, and kind of as a university administrator, perhaps I can claim to know a bit more about this. And I'm going to say something which perhaps will make me the most popular university kind of administrator in the country. But it does seem to me that there's a problem if we're going to be increasing expenditure on kind of university students, and that we kind of actually at the same time we're going to decrease expenditure on university infrastructure. For the types of challenges that we face as a society, being and just think about climate, we kind of going to need an extensive amount of kind of scientific kind of expertise in our university, and by that I mean in kind of all of the sciences, natural sciences, human sciences, economic sciences, etc. Really, if we want to deal with these issues, we want to do it on the basis of having universities that are at the top of all of those sciences. What we're doing in the choices that we've made is to fund one kind of group that has a claim on those resources, kind of really, I think, at the expense of the long-term sustainability of those actual institutions. And I think if if you follow the reports that you've had today, kind of, I think you can highlight a number of instances where these sorts of choices have been made. I think it's imperative on us who are in universities, those of us who are in civil society, those of us who work in these areas, to kind of highlight the incoherence of these choices, because I think the choices that we're making now in these areas really affect both the long-term kind of trajectory of our society, but also the options that we're going to have tomorrow. And I think that the seminar today has really highlighted all of those choices. So let me then thank you all for your inputs today, and kind of enjoy your lunch, and kind of do look out for more of these sorts of seminars from the center. Thank you all. Enjoy the rest of your day.